gonna take crackerjack timing, Wang.
Total concentration. You ready, Jack?
I was born ready.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and Doc wanted to talk about the way that talent is being developed within the comic book industry at this time. I think most people would agree that there's been a degradation as far as writing quality, but also we're starting to see a pretty very distinctive degradation as far as artistic quality. Whereas for a long time, the art really, I don't know if it got better, but it certainly got more detailed. There's a lot more going on in the pages. I think we're starting to see it kind of devolve at this point. I think Doc and I both agree that it has a lot to do with how they're mentoring and developing comic book talent. Obviously, here talking with me about this is the X-Men historian, the Marvel aficionado. Doc, how you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Thanks for having me on to talk about this.
It's crazy. I had Brett Smith on the channel. I think it was about a year and a half, maybe it was 2 years ago. We talked about the current state of developing artistic talent. He had a lot to say. I'm going to link that into this video. And I think this kind of falls into that. Whereas, back in the day, let's say when you had, we'll go with Valiant under Jim Shooter, when he decided to open up his own comics publisher, they had their bullpen. They had their established artists, the guys on the front lines, and then they would have their art that they were developing that was kind of right next to that artist. And that's how you developed your art talent. They sat there, they learned from the best of the best, and eventually they would take over. They'd do a fill-in issue here or there, and eventually they would get their own title when they were ready. But that seems to have been thrown out the door. There's no real mentorship. It appears there's not a lot of really working together. It appears most artists work from home, so it's hard to mentor somebody if they're not sitting right next to you. Are you really going to be able to mentor as far as art over Zoom calls or something like that? And I think that's a big problem. Another problem is like the scouting. It feels like the scouting is being done on like Tumblr and webcomics.
You're not wrong in any of this. I agree completely. There was this slow kind of natural organic development of the way that artists, way, I'm talking 80 years ago. You had a bunch of guys that were from advertising or that were doing little strips in the newspaper or whatever. And they started doing comics. They started doing comic books. And you could see a slow, in addition to the fact that guys would be sticking around on books for years and years. So they improved their style that way and they kind of honed their craft. But in addition, they started working for more organized publishers. And most of these guys back then, they all lived around New York. Because that's where the publishing was. That's
where the jobs were.
Yeah. So there are these local guys from Brooklyn or the Bronx or maybe even Manhattan. And they'd have to go into the office and drop stuff off. Over time, they'd start meeting the other guys that were also drawing. So they'd end up kind of making friends. Sometimes they'd probably hate each other. Sometimes it was probably friendly rivalries. But they started learning from each other and improving their craft as a result. And you had that happen for a good number of decades. Everything was still generally being done in the New York area where the publishers were. And then in the 80s, you started seeing the start of they kind of took that to the next level. In addition to, going out and grabbing a couple of beers with some other artist that also works for the same publisher that you're submitting to and talking about art and maybe just sketching a little bit, they took the next step and started creating the bullpens where they'd have creators coming in. Sometimes they were working in the office, sometimes they were working from home, but they'd be learning from each other on site. So you'd have the younger artists that were newer also learning that way. Then it took the next step, which was the start of the studio model, where you'd have things like Homage Studios. And I don't know if you remember Homage Studios, but they're what became Wildstorm. It was
perfect. I want to talk about this.
It was Jim Lee. It was Scott Williams. It was Willis Portacio. I think Art T-Bear eventually ended up part of that, but don't quote me on that one. And they were working out of the same shared creative space. So they're all looking over each other's work, learning from each other. And you see, as the years got by, as artists started working more closely and closely together, probably criticizing something, stealing style, the details from each other, you started seeing this rapid increase in the quality of art. And it started as artists started working a lot more closely with one another. Then you had like Wildstorm, you had Extreme, Rob Liefeld's Extreme Studios, you had Mark Silvestri's Top Cow. They started bringing all these creators in. I mean, Mark Silvestri was basically mentoring Michael Turner. Who did Michael Turner ended up going and creating Aspen Studios and started mentoring guys like Talent Caldwell and others. You had Rob Liefeld with Merritt Michaels, Dan Panosian, another Stephen Platt, all these guys that were good, but they were raw. And they'd find these guys from talent searches, from portfolio reviews, and they'd be like, look, you're awesome, you're good, I can make you better, come work for me. And they'd start by doing finish work. They'd be drawing backgrounds, they'd be inking, they'd be doing all these little pieces, kind of, it was like baseball or sports, where you're taking the minor leagues and you're put in, and then you're doing spot work here and there. And
we got like almost like creator trees where Jim Lee's at the top, and then you can see like the 2 or 3 creators, and then you can see how he's affected the industry over time. All these talents that have been developed directly from his mentorship of 1 or 2 or 3 creators.
Yeah, and you had the same with Mark Silvestri. You had the same with Rob Liefeld. You didn't really have as much with Todd. Todd kind of worked by himself, but a lot of
Todd's
those guys.
amazing talent evaluator.
He is.
Tony Daniel, Greg Capullo. The list goes on. Like Jason Sean Alexander, the guy can develop or spot and develop talent.
Yeah, and but he always did it a little bit on a more one-on-one kind of basis, whereas like Jim and Rob and Mark would hire a half dozen artists and bring in and kind of mentor all of them at once. And because you got, I mean, from Jim you got J. Scott Campbell, Brett Booth, but you got.
So I want to talk about Brett Booth. That was one of my examples.
Yeah,
Brett Booth. Recently in X-Men Legends number 1 and 2, the dude, if you want someone that's going to illustrate an X-Men comic and look like Jim Lee, that's not Jim Lee, Brett Booth is your man.
Yeah.
Certainly that was developed during his time at Wildstorm working with Jim Lee. But you see him over on Flash or Flash Forward, that does not look like a Jim Lee comic book.
No.
He's a very talented. He can do certain things that are directly inspired by Jim Lee, but Jim Lee certainly helped him develop his talent, and he can do amazing stuff on Flash, like some of the most kinetic Flash comics you'll ever see, where it's all about movement and energy, which a Flash comic should be.
Yes,
so
exactly.
he's actually a very talented. You see him on Bloodshot. That does not look like the same art that you're seeing on Flash, because he can adapt to the character and what the mood of the comic is supposed to be.
Exactly. He's got a huge range.
Yeah, so Brett Booth is an amazing talent. But because of where we are today, like he's not heading up a studio where he's developing 6 or 7 talents at this time, and we're developing even more badass talents out of it. And like, is Brett Booth the end of the road? Like as far as the Jim Lee tree? I don't want it to sound too negative. Just the way that it's modeled right now, it seems it sucks, because I don't know that like it's Brett's dream job to go out there and mentor and help develop artistic talent. It might be, but he'd be like the perfect man for the job. He's such a wealth of knowledge, and he's got such a wide variety of art that he can do and execute.
You're kind of right on that. He is out there though mentoring a little bit, not as much.
I always see him giving feedback.
Oh,
and stuff. Like I've seen him on social media. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like 1-on-1 or maybe 1-on-3, really developing talent, being in there and driving the art and really, getting these guys up to another level, like to his level.
And a lot of that has to do with the way that he's, he kind of lives out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, so like him having a bunch of people, working in an office in a studio isn't really feasible because we're now in a much more disconnected world. I mean, we're all interconnected.
We're all connected, but everybody can be disconnected.
Yes, exactly. We can all be, I mean, I'm sitting here having a conversation with you from Pittsburgh and you're over in the Philippines.
Yeah.
So we're a more connected world in some way, but actually being in the presence of other people. And I think that's where, at least from a talent aspect, that really is so huge and so forgotten.
Well, it's even it's weirder with writers. Have you noticed the new kingmaker mentality? Well, it'll be a new writer. They'll have done almost nothing. The next thing you know, you got fucking Scott Snyder. Who else? We got Donnie Cates. Obviously, what's his dick? Tim Seeley. Well, oh my God, this is the best writer I've ever read. And the next thing you know, they're writing 2 miniseries on Marvel. They're fucking writing a Batman miniseries, and then they got 2 other series on, Vault and Image, and you're going, who the fuck is this? And then you go in there,
and it's terrible.
You got to check it out. You're like, this is the most greenest goose shit writer I've ever seen in my life. They can't do dialogue, and they're not executing stories. But for some reason, there's some type of weird backdoor channeling going out where everyone just all of a sudden starts signal boosting this person and making them look like a total asshole because they're not ready yet.
Exactly. And now to some degree, in the same way that I really love the Image guys for the way that they kind of really took the studio model and blew it up, I hate the Image guys because they did the start of what we're getting right now, which is, well, we don't know any writers.
Don't matter. Anybody can write a fucking comic.
Well, part of that and part of we don't know any writers. So let's just hire our buddies to write the dialogue for our comics. And if you look at some of those early Wildcats and Stormwatch and Cyberforce and Youngblood comics, the writing is, now Rob wrote Youngblood, but the writing is goddamn trash. And it's because they hired a bunch of nobodies that were just their friends.
Hey, John, sleeping on my couch because you don't have a job. I got a job for you.
Yeah,
throw some words into my comic. Look at these beautiful pages.
Yeah, and I'll pay you in not charging you rent.
Pay you nachos.
Yeah. I mean, so that is part of it. It's that same mentality. And the thing is, though, the Image guys
learned nepotism too, like Mark Waid's girlfriend and stuff. Like, you want to write Nightwing? Let me talk to DC. I got a connection. Oh, you're the Nightwing writer. You say you like the character.
And the thing is, though, all the Image guys learned their goddamn lesson on this. Rob had to go out and hire Alan Moore to really make his stuff work. Silvestri had to bring in Chris Claremont on Cyberforce to really make that book work. Jim had to bring in Warren Ellis. He had to bring in, and now if we get into,
was it Mark Miller?
Oh, now we could talk about that some other time. The way the pipeline of creatives from, and you know what? No, this actually still does have to do with this, because Wildstorm started bringing in guys that were talented and young, and they worked their way up from a bunch of indie pulp stuff, or in Ellis's case, he was kind of already established. But Jim Lee had to bring in Alan Moore and James Robinson to make Wildcats into anything good. And then he had to bring in Warren Ellis to make Stormwatch into anything good. But then he started really finding talent and developing it. Out of the guys that came out of there, Mark Miller, Ed Brubaker, Joe Casey, Scott Lobdell. Now, Lobdell had already he had started on X-Men. But still, You had all these writers and all these artists coming out of this studio model where they were working relatively close together. It's important. That is, it's a
Iron
forgotten
sharpens
thing.
iron. If you're sitting down there working with the best, you're only going to improve alongside of each other. If you're the best writer in the world and you've got some limp dick writer that doesn't know dick, neither of you are going to get better. In fact, the worst guy is probably going to get worse because he's going to be embarrassed constantly.
And the guy that's talented might actually get worse because he realized he doesn't have to put as much effort in to beat the other guy. It's a race to the bottom. Oh, Marvel in the 2000s under Joe Quesada, it really started turning out amazing work. Do you know that like 90% of those guys that were really the marquee writers, and artists, they all came out of Wildstorm. You had Brubaker, you had Hitch, you had Miller, you had Warren Ellis, you had a handful of other artists that started really working for, Carlos Deanda. You had a number of writers and artists that Marvel just kept stealing away from Wildstorm because that worked as the minor leagues for the pros. There was a feeder system. And now
weird. Marvel and DC are now the feeder system for fucking Mark Miller's Miller World.
Yes. Yes, Mark Miller managed to turn this whole damn thing on its head. And the result is the biggest books on the planet have the worst talent and the most raw, unpolished, not ready for prime time creators on it. And all the shit that nobody cares about from a consumer aspect is the stuff that has the best creators on it.
Yeah. Marvel's a joke now. Their version of talent scouting is, how many boxes do you check? Ooh, you've got 3 of the 5 boxes we want to be checked. You're a new hotshot or writer. Like, I got news for you, Doc. Pele and I are reviewing Danny Lore's Champions on Monday. It fucking sucks. Don't listen to what all the other comic pros are telling you out on there on Twitter. It's bullshit. It's a smokescreen. There's a reason they're trying to tell you before you get in there how great it is. So when you actually read it, you go in there, maybe it'll mask the stench of absolute shit, emanating off the paper.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, Danny Lore got in there because of Vita Ayala. Vita Ayala got in there because whatever. I don't know.
Because she was in Scott Snyder's writer's room course thing that he did.
But you know what? Like, even that is
as
terrible.
Soon as she was done, she had a headline series at Valiant, and she was writing for both Marvel and DC, and I think she had another series. Whether they were a good writer or not, they were thrown to the fucking wolves and absolutely failed in the spotlight immediately.
Oh, yeah.
Continue to fail. Go read Children of the Atom.
No.
Tell me it's good.
No. But still. So now you have this weird, there used to be a very simple system. You started at the bottom, you slowly worked your way up, you improved along the way, you get little gigs. You get incremental. It was climbing the ladder in the industry. Now the ladder's a goddamn zigzag. Somehow you have the 2 of DC's biggest creators.
The ladder is a pegboard, and they decide where your peg goes.
Yeah, it's like
you fit the right demographics, you're at the top, even though you can't write a damn comic book nowadays.
Yes, I mean, you look at the creators, the 2 creators that were the biggest work for DC last year are now doing some weird, stupid bullshit sci-fi book at Image called Geiger that no one cares about.
Well, Jason Fabok was on 3 Jokers, although he's working at Image, I believe, as well with Jeff Johns. But I get what
sorry,
you're
I thought that my timeline.
Gary Frank
I was thinking Doomsday Clock. No, I was thinking Doomsday Clock, and I thought that was last year. It must be 2 years ago. Time's weird. I'm old. So but yeah, the biggest creative team of 2 years ago at DC is doing a book at Image that exactly 0 people that aren't currently reading comics would ever even know exist.
It's good.
I bought the first issue. I bought the glow in the dark one this past week because why not? And because I'm a sucker for glow in the dark covers, but I haven't read it yet.
You are eternally 5 years old, Doc. Did you know
Yes, I am. But still, there was a ladder. You climbed it, and now it's a pegboard where you jump up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down, and you're all over the map over the course of your career. There's no trajectory. Randomizing.
They don't know how to develop. They don't know how to develop talent. They don't know how to develop stars. And if they find a star, they do everything in their power to extinguish it almost immediately because they could become bigger than the company.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I guess they're still learning that lesson, the poor lesson from 1991. Don't let your stars outshine your characters. So instead of making their characters more important, they just extinguish the stars.
Doesn't make sense, Doc. So this has been a good conversation. Obviously, we do need to wrap this up, but
yeah,
there's a problem with developing talent. We'll see. I think the indies are probably where the talent is being developed, but is it being developed well? Are they ready for superhero comics? There's not a lot of superhero comics really in the indies. It's more genre stuff outside of superheroes. So I don't think the system's working right now, but we'll see.
I figure it this way. You grow. There's no trajectory to people's careers, and they just kind of wither in the wind and blow. There's no rudder to anything. It's a rudderless industry, and rudderless ships tend to crash into the rocks.